Hey guys, how you doing?
What's going on, Patrick?
Nothing much. How's it going with you?
Good. I'm just about to set up my light.
Fair point. How you two doing?
Good. How you doing?
Sorry, Damien, if that's your right name. I know I talked to you. I'm just talking to Sexy and Clary.
For sure.
Hi, Claire. Hi, Patrick. Hello, Damien. Oh, I have strange lighting in here today. It's kind of exciting. I'm in my other room. How are you guys doing? Yay.
Doing good.
Awesome. How was your week? Week 1.5, week 2.
It was kind of long. I guess I'm coming out of that summer mode.
Yeah. It's crazy that this is week 2, right? Because the first week was a half a week and it just feels like it's impossible that we were supposed to get anything done. I mean, that's how I feel. How about you?
Yep, I can agree with that.
Okay, so I'm going to pop them in the chat screen. So go ahead and send your check-in. And please, if your name is different here than it is on Canvas, since I give you guys extra credit for showing up live to these, then please help me remember what it's spelled like on your Canvas page. I was like, what's behind me? I was working on my Legos back here.
Do you want us just to put our name in?
Yeah, just because then I'll do usually like a check-in and a check-in in the middle and the end. Or I'll like ask a question in the end, and that's part of how I do the extra credit. So the extra credit for attending live, you get a couple points just for showing up, and then a couple more points if you're like dialoguing with me in some way, answering my questions or like asking questions, that sort of a thing. Oh, you guys, my coffee cup is empty. Can I live? So hi. I would love to know, and it's okay to be honest, how much of the material you got through so far, especially considering that, you know, it's like a week and a half instead of 2 weeks.
Hoping to get started.
Okay. So we haven't read anything yet. How about you guys, Damien and Claire? Have you gotten through any of the reading? It'll just help me know whether I should speed or not.
I'm gonna be honest. I haven't started yet.
Okay, that's fine. It's normal. How about you, Claire?
I've watched quite a few of the videos,
Right.
And I took off all of the written material. I tried to put it into one Word document, you know, for ease of, you know, study, because otherwise I get messed up with the, you know, the Canvas pages trying to like, look at this stuff. So I saw it, I was a little confused with the way the modules were set up, because the introduction, was that considered a module?
Good
All
question.
that introductory? Yeah.
Okay, let me.
I don't mean to be difficult, but yeah, it was a little confusing. And then when I took the the quiz, I really got messed up. But I tried to go back to the Zoom meeting. Okay, like you had the past meetings and what was it, the cloud and this and that. But I tried all different ways, but I couldn't access back into the Zoom meeting from the 20th. So I don't know if that's all set up or I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, let me turn on my share screen and I'll do a little, we'll do a
Okay.
drive-by.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna put myself in speaker mode, you guys, but I love, this should feel, it's not going to, I'm sure, but I would love these meetings to feel more like discussions and less like I'm talking at you. So please feel free to interrupt me at any time, because if I don't hear from you, then I'll just go on and on and on. And I would much rather have a conversation, but professoritis, I tend to fill. Okay, cool.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to share screen and drive us around the Canvas page for a second. Okay. Where's the best page to drive around? Let's go through here. Okay, so here we are in my Canvas page. You go to courses and select the course. That I'm sure you guys all have the hang of that already. So I'm going to turn on student view so that it looks different, or it looks more like what you guys see. So here we are on the home page. You can see some of the recent announcements. Those announcements are automated. I wrote them all last time, so the date's a little bit off. I'm sorry, but usually they're pretty close. They're a good place to find links if you saw a link pass by your email and you're like, where was that? Beginning of the course, we have, this is all essentially what you would find on, you remember those old-fashioned green syllabus pages? That stuff is all in here, like how to contact me, how often to check in on the class. Usually I say think about 2 times. So I'm gonna just toggle those closed. And this is our registration week. So this is where you found that discussion to introduce yourself to your peers. And I'm going to close that one up. So this number 1 is week 1, which would have been that half week, and number 2 is week 2, which is this week. And then the letters here I'm using to denote the topical categories in this course. Yeah, so hopefully last week you perused all of this orientation stuff and read through this first section, which is talking about the terminology that we use for talking about dance. And I can touch on this too if you want to go over some of that stuff. And then this week would be 2, it's the beginning of category A, community. So we're going to talk about how freestyling versus choreographed movement. And we're going to start with some nice dark history, right? So my hope is that you read through this hybrid tradition article and you can see how I said which pages to read. That actually, I think I need to update that. I think I can squeeze it down a little bit more for you guys. Yay! So I'm thinking 1 to 4 and then just the last couple of paragraphs. So I'll show you that in a second. But on here, we have a lot of pages that are writing and videos, and the videos are longer or shorter. So I want you to scan a lot of them, especially dance videos. Like you can kind of pop through and watch, and then watch more of ones that you find fascinating. But if you got the gist of what's going on in a dance video, you can choose to not watch every single one all the way through, because there's a lot. And then this is today's discussion that's going on right now, the 2A discussion, and the stuff that I refer to in the classes in this discussion materials page. So if we're in this talk and you want to take a deeper dive into any of the resources I put in, then even if they're not on this page right now and I think of showing you something else, I'll add it onto that page so you know where to find anything that's in the Zoom is going to be on that page. Does that help, Claire, clarify that part? Oh, and your other question was how to get to the Zoom recordings, right?
Okay, so the second part of the sorry, it's hopping around here.
I'm sure you're not the only one with these questions, so it's all right.
Okay, yeah, the 2A weekly Zoom discussion, that's what we're on right now, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And then right under it, it says week 2A discussion materials. Now, are these additional materials that you throw in after the discussion?
Yeah, so these discussion materials this is basically like my notes that I refer to while I'm having this discussion with you guys. And then if we get on a tangent and I'm like, oh, let me show you this, I'll add it in here. So anyone who's watched the discussion who wants to like see more of a video that maybe I just show you 30 seconds of, I'll stick all those links back in here so they're easier to find. It's also a good reminder for me because I haven't done this lecture in a year now, right? Almost.
But then the overall Zoom meeting, if you want to look at the Zoom meeting again, that's a whole different area, right?
Yes. So if you want to watch a recording of the Zoom meeting, then you come over here on Zoom. And it will load. And so when you guys came here to watch the live Zoom, it probably popped you into like the Zoom looking website. But there's this mini Zoom version within Canvas. And so this is upcoming, obvious, right? Previous meetings. I don't know what this is for, the previous meetings tab, because cloud recordings is what you'd be looking for. So you can see that these are the previous discussions because I did 4 times of the orientation. So this would be where you would find previous.
Okay, this page that you're on right now, I couldn't access any of that. I tried both the cloud recording and the previous meeting.
So when you came here, it showed you that you didn't have access?
It said I didn't have permission.
It means the system has logged you out and you probably have to re-log in. And if that's not working, then totally tech support is the way to get help with that.
Okay.
Yeah, but usually that just means the system automatically logs you out after like 45 minutes. So even though we're in this Zoom right now, by the end of the Zoom, we'll all have been logged out and you just got to log back in again. And the way that I do that, maybe this is helpful, is I have bookmarked this. Let me scooch down so you can, that's not what I need. I have bookmarked this Zoom page, smccd.zoom.us. It always takes you back to this login. So whenever I see that I don't have access to something, I just load this page, hit sign in, and it comes back here. And if you're like, on the Zoom website, the SMCCD Zoom website, you can click on the schools and it'll bring you back to this login page. And that usually fixes the access issues.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't see this portion.
Yeah, so this is like the Zoom website for the school district. And then this is within Canvas, like the mini Zoom page. So they do look different. But those are the hot tips I have. And remember that tech support is there 24 hours a day, whereas I am not. But anytime you see something like you don't have access or you need to log back in or a password issue, I can't specifically help you guys with that anyway. I just have guesses, right? But tech support can walk you through fixing any of that stuff. Or if you like can't see a picture, all that stuff, tech support is great help for. Yeah, does that cover that question?
Yeah, well, I guess next time I try, I'll find out, right?
Yes, yes. Don't be shy about tech support. They really are helpful. I know sometimes we all have like a little bit of trauma around bad tech support, but they tend to be pretty good. Okay, so shall we dive into the material? Okay, so I'm trying to think of where to start now. Because I did orientations for both 100 and 102, we didn't talk a lot about dance history, family tree in the orientation meeting. So I'll just take a hot second to zoom in here. This class, Dance 102, I was saying in our orientation that I started teaching this class because I love jazz dance. So I am a jazz dancer. I do mostly jazz and contemporary modern. I've been teaching at Skyline since 2008 now, which is it's kind of starting to blow my mind. And my focus in dance has always been concert dance and musicals. So I came to dance really late. As a community college student, it was when I first started taking real like technique dance classes on a regular basis. And originally I did acting and then musical theater and played saxophone for a long time in like middle school and high school. So I didn't really dance during that whole time. It was junior college that brought me into it. And so I love the subject. I'm really passionate about feminism and LGBTQ issues. And so I started this curriculum. I wrote this curriculum thinking about like, why is it that when I went to college, I went to UC Berkeley, which is a pretty liberal school, y'all, we didn't talk about jazz dance in our courses because there was already a really big bias about concert dance, right? And that came from the Western Eurocentric obsession with ballet. And academia finally started teaching dance at all in sort of the 1940s when like Mills College was one of the first college dance programs that we had. That's where I went for grad school. And so there's always been this bias to look at academic courses looking not at dances from around the world, but mostly Western Eurocentric dance. And there's also been the bias of looking at dances that look, well, this is true of like all art, like thinking about quote unquote high art versus low art. So high art is like ballet or the orchestra where people go and dress up. And why do we consider that high art? There's some good reasons and some stupid reasons. But in the last, I'd say 20, 30 years, there's been a real attempt to push back on that and to have academic classes grow up and be inclusive. So when I wrote this class initially, I thought it was going to focus mostly on jazz dance and sexy dances, right? Like, yeah, give me some hot jazz dancing, like all the music video dances that we did. Thinking about the other dance that I've done recently is that I was in a can troupe for a couple of years. And so like that obviously has all these sexual overtones and like are those, you know, they're super athletic performers, but then at the same time you're like lifting your skirts up, so they were always shunned. That was where I started. But then when I taught this class for, it hasn't been very long, I realized that that was not actually the main focus of this course, because when I dug back into jazz dance, I was like, wait. We're not just talking about jazz dance. We're talking about jazz funk. We're talking about the history of hip hop. Jazz dance, streets to stage as we know it, is really, we usually use the term to refer to stuff that you see in music videos and stuff that you see on Broadway now. And it's a big blend, and this is where this picture comes in. It's a big blend of African dance and also ballet influences and tap. right? So like as we're kind of gonna travel all over in time, because Dance 100 is really linear from the past to the future. So we're gonna hop back in time today to talk about the Middle Passage and caste in our country. But when I first taught this class, it was the summer of 2020, which we all know in America means that there were protests in the street. And I was like, okay, this is me. Obviously not a person of color, definitely a person, like I grew up a single mom and what I consider reasonably poor, but like definitely a person of privilege, right? I got to go to college and my mom expected me to go to college. So the first thing for me to do is to just acknowledge that in the forefront of this class, because I will therefore inevitably get things wrong, say things wrong, and I'm doing my best to share a more broad perspective on American history and culture. But I do really cherish feedback from you guys, the students, who have other perspectives, who have other experiences. And so we just need to like take a moment and really honor that even though I'm in the position of professor, you guys and your voices are super important to me, and I'm not always going to be right. How about that for a starting place? It's also not your job to take on the emotional burden of correcting me, but I appreciate it if you do. Okay, so back to dance. We are in this first module talking about history of dance, and this reading, the hybrid tradition, actually I have it open already. So go ahead and read. I leave the page numbers at the top here. Some of these I've highlighted, but I haven't been able to do all of them yet, so I probably will. So I was rereading this morning, and I think you don't need to get to page 5. Let's just get around to page 4 is the way to go. So this is page 4. I'm referring to the reader here page, and just read on to this point. And what I want you to get out of the Baines article is 2 terms. One is hybrid dance, and 2 is fusion dance. And those 2 words could mean the same way, but usually if dance historians are talking about it in terms of dance, when we say hybrid, what we mean is that 2 communities or practitioners of dance are hanging out together and they start to share moves together, and the dances both change to become a new hybrid. So for example, in early America, we had Irish immigrants and African slaves living in the same neighborhoods, or African freedmen also, depending on which part of the country you're in, working in the same neighborhoods, living in the same neighborhoods and the tenements, and dancing together. And the buck and jig and wing dances that came from the African traditions, and the tapping and shuffling from the Irish step dancing, became a hybrid that is what we now know of as tap dance, right? So those were actually people hanging out together, dancing together. We'll talk lots more about that, but that would be a definition of hybrid. And then fusion is the term that is used. It's especially used in belly dance right now. And it's like, some people think fusion is a really cool term, but then some other people use it as like an identifier, like a code switch to note when 2 or more dance styles have come together because of appropriation. So there's a big sort of scandalous thing going on right now that belly dancing is really popular in Russia right now. And loads of Russian practitioners of belly dance tend to do choreographies wherein they are taking costuming and dance moves and themes and just pasting them on top of their belly dancing and calling it tribal fusion. And so it's like got nothing to do with, I mean, I'm sure they really like the themes that they're taking from, but it's often extremely appropriative and not, it's not respectful, and it's usually appropriation is usually offensive when the person who is doing a dance or wearing a costume has not actually taken the time to study with the community that initially created it. And so there's not a deeper understanding or respect, or they're not giving credit to where the dance or the costuming came from. And so when that happens in dance, we usually use the term fusion as opposed to hybridization. And both things have been going on in dance in general forever and ever and ever and ever. So what we want to do is trying to think about what order to go in. Let's talk about we haven't watched any dance yet, so normally I go straight into the history, but I'm like, should we pause first? Yeah, let's pause, because we're going to get into some talking about slavery. So let's take a moment first and look at fun dance, yes? And then we'll kind of roll backwards. I am excited because I just
Can I ask a
yes
question here?
Ask me a question. I'm going to look up a video in the meanwhile.
Okay, yeah, you said interrupt freely, so
yes, please.
I can follow you with the hybrid dance.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I'm following you with the fusion dance. I'm not sure I'm completely getting that, because how is it being decided that the people haven't delved deeply enough into that particular dance style and the history of it? I mean, who's deciding that? How do they tell that?
That is such a good question. That is really such a good question. You guys have a guess? Like, why? Who decides? What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you think, Patrick? No wrong answers here.
Honestly, I don't really know.
Well, who do you think is normally deciding?
I know no wrong answers. That
oh, sorry. I'm making faces because I'm looking for a video, not because of you guys.
Okay. I don't know. It seems, you could have a whole dance troupe, say 20 people, 5 of them might, really be honoring the dance inside themselves, study the history of it. 15 of them could be appropriating or have that attitude. I mean, who knows what makes it the fusion, okay, with the appropriation.
Yeah. Okay, I found my video. So I think that there's not one answer to this. And I think the best way to know about this is really to have a dialogue about it. And generally speaking, the people who it would be most responsible and respectful to give the power of decision making to are the people who originated the dance forms, right? And if we're sort of taking that perspective from the start, we're going to have a much better chance of not being disrespectful to the roots of the dance. So this whole situation, of course, has been constantly tied up in privilege and caste. So let's take the 1920s, for example. In the 1920s, we still had segregation. So we had minstrel shows were mostly ending. And we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about that, how there was both white people wearing blackface in minstrel shows, and that popularized it all over the country. But there were also Black performers who were sometimes wearing blackface and sometimes not, depending on how late in the practice it was, and how They also were very famous, but sometimes couldn't get in front of white audiences, which would pay less, therefore, because the white audiences had more money. And so then you end up with white stars who are richer, who have a bigger popularity because they're being paid more by the white audiences. And so the white performers are getting more credit, and the white performers are saying like, oh, I choreographed this dance, which may or may not be true. And then by the 1920s, you have like things like Ziegfeld's Follies, right? So like hordes and hordes of white girls doing tap dancing, getting super famous. And those white dancers would often go to Harlem to study under the authentic tap dancers who had like created the moves. And sometimes these were really healthy and positive relationships. And at that time, by the 1920s, there was a little bit more. See, I'm even questioning myself saying this right now. In the 1920s in Harlem, there was enough cultural power and respect going on in some of those segregated dance halls that you would think that it's likely that they could have not accepted some white dancers who came to train with them. But even that, we got a question, right? Because they might have really needed the money, which is a form of power. And they might have just like not wanted to burn a bridge, which is a form of caste power. So did those white dancers contribute to tap dancing? Absolutely. Did tap dancing look different after people who had trained in ballet and like this upright, dapper form changed the way that tapping looked when it was in its earlier forms, which was very down low and related more to the buck dancing? Absolutely. But there's no like straight answer about it. And that's one of the reasons why Bojangles is so well known. It's not just because he hung out with Shirley Temple, it's because he actually like flip hybridized tap dance. So Bojangles is the tap dancer that we know who changed dancing from being really down, and we'll look at examples of this, to being upright. So Bojangles usually performed in tuxedos. He's famous for his stair dance where he's rising up metaphorically in the cast. He became like one of the first Black stars to appear as a soloist on stage, because there were actually rules about like how you can only have 2 Black performers or a group of Black performers in the middle of your general variety show. Like you might not have too many Black acts in a variety show because they were trying to keep them down on, like, you didn't want the amazing Black performers to overshadow the rest of the white acts, and you didn't want to highlight just one Black dancer as being a super mega star because they might overshadow the white acts. Like all of that is really valid and true. So now the question of like, is it hybrid or is it fusion? I think there isn't a good answer, but a good way to know is by looking at the communities who created the movements and to ask whether those communities are still involved, like to ask whether those communities are giving the thumbs up, like, yeah, we really like what you're doing with this over here. So I used some older examples, but this is very pertinent right now when you think about current modern day hip hop videos and how most hip hop videos that are super popular right now are not coming out of Compton, for example, where Rise and like Crumping came from. They're coming out of Asia. So on that note, do we have any comments about that? Did we kind of not answer your question?
Well, I think it leads me to another state of confusion or another question. The it would seem that all of these things we're talking about could be considered, you know, different percentages of hybrids, but But then if we're using this word fusion, are there fusion dances that are not tainted with appropriation? Or is that what fusion means? There's appropriation going on.
Well, I think fusion.
You understand?
Yeah. I think fusion is a term that was being used, especially in the 90s and 2000s and even still today. And it was supposed to be like, I really love this kind of dance, so I learned about it maybe from videos or whatever. And then I'm just mixing it in with my style.
But isn't that what happened with the Irish immigrants and the Blacks when they combined together, and you know, this tap they combined together?
I'm sure somewhat, but no, because those dancers were actually dancing together in the same place, as opposed to, especially now with video or going to see a show, if you went and saw something and then copied it, as opposed to like spending time with the person saying, wow, this is an interesting step.
So it means, sorry, it's the Zoom is kind of elongating. I don't know if I sound like taffy being stretched on your side, but anyway, I'm just thinking that the fusion, then you're saying that it's a more like superficial, you know, grab, so to speak. That it's not like there's any, you know, exchange that people would consider to have depth and meaning. They didn't interact together. They just saw something and they said, I like it, I'm taking it, you know, and that was it.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
All right.
Yes. And that's not going to be a totally always definition of those words, but that's the way we use it in academic conversations about dance. So yeah, you've got it.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Here we go. Fun times. This is a video that I watched this week and I thought it was fun. Let's go theater mode because that'll be prettier. Have you guys seen this yet? Are we gonna play a little video? So kinges are what I would call competitive hip hop, like a competition style hip hop performing group. So it's very current, right? They've been around for at least 10 years, I think. I believe they are located in Southern California. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is, how do we know that this is competition hip hop? And one of the reasons that we know this is because competitions get judged on demonstrating multiple styles of hip hop. Right, so we just had a section with like b-boy moves. They also get judged on synchronicity. You almost never see those b-boy moves in sync like that. It's really quite impressive. And another reason that we know that this is competition style hip hop dance is, of course, it's choreographed, and there are lots of formation changes. So this formation is basically a triangle with a point towards us, right? Headed for somewhere to go. Anywhere cinema these days. Don't know where to go. Gotta keep giving them. We have a tutting session. And I've been dealing with so many things, having so many dreams. Another formation change. Levels are valued in choreography for competition hip hop. So you can see how they're doing all similar arm movements, but they're like switching the levels. So some of the dancers were lower and some of them were higher. And there was like a little subtle formation change there. It's especially valued transitions of formations when you can kind of be surprised that suddenly the people are in a different place in the room. So, do you guys, I'm gonna stop share for a second. Did you guys see what, well, first of all, do you guys have any words yet for the different styles of hip hop choreography in that video? Maybe, maybe not.
I just seen them breakdance, and that was pretty much it. But I know they did some other stuff.
Yeah, they did. Earlier in the video, they were doing, and this might not come over super clearly because Zoom sometimes like delays and is jerky, right? But like earlier, they were doing sort of a older popping and locking style, and then like later in the video, they're doing animation style, which is an evolved, like a more current version of popping and locking. Because popping and locking is basically like bigger movements, like the robot is sort of around the same style era as popping and locking, but animation style is really tiny movements, just like you're watching really old animation. So there's a lot more freezes in each movement. And so when you see a video that's like a group where they're doing those little chunks of different styles, that's one of the like ear markers of competition style hip hop, because they're trying to earn those points in the choreography. If that makes sense. Anyway, I saw that yesterday in one of our introduction discussions when I was grading. I was like, yeah, I really liked it. It was cool. I especially like that we hadn't been seeing the camera doing choreography in those videos before. And since I'm married to a videographer, I particularly love that. So I was excited that like, instead of the cuts just being like, cut, next scene, they were like zooming above and looking down and looking up and coming through. Anyway, I dorked out on that. It was really cool. Okay, so let's then, I'm just gonna find a little freeze frame in here. I realize I haven't turned, oh, also props. Using props in hip hop is a big thing. Competitive hip hop, I should say. Okay, here's my screen share. So how do we, what I'm hoping by the end of this class is that we get a sense of looking at a dance, and I don't expect you to be able to say all of this precision dance terms. Like I mean, that would be great, but I also feel like knowing the name of a bunch of dance moves can be helpful to talk about dance, but it's not necessary. We can talk about dance just in terms of like basic body movements that we all know the names of. For example, in this freeze frame, we have these guys over here with their arms are like flung in a downward motion. And the guys on the left side of the screen have their arms up and they're making sort of a diamond shape, right? There's no dance terms there. So even with just that much vocabulary in terms of dance descriptions, we can still talk about how to recognize moves that come from different community groups. So when we're looking at hip hop a lot of the time, we don't usually see these super awesome high kicks that happen in these Zulu dancers movement. But we do see the athleticism, and we'll talk about that some more, and the acrobatic flips that happen in this video. This is just like a random example. And you can see that there is choreography going on here for sure, right? Because they're all in sync. Whenever they're in sync, we know that they have practiced it a bunch of times, so it's set choreography. And also the super low kneeling motion, which is like, did you see how just a hot second ago, this soloist, who might have been freestyling in this moment, he is like do you see how he popped his hips down? That reminded me visually of the duck walk that we see in like ballroom dance performance. Not ballroom dance, sorry, I shouldn't say it just like that, but in ballroom competitions, we'll get to that at the end of the semester. And then here's another example. So this is the Agbadza. Forgive my terrible pronunciation, I apologize. But you can see a lot of these, they're called winging movements, yeah, of the arms, where you're like flapping those, we call it now the chicken wing, right? Or the funky chicken was a name that we used for an evolved version of that arm movement in the, what would that be, like 90s? But also you can see that they are pulsing their pelvises forward with a forward accent. Yeah. And then in this Congolese video, I think this is really awesome because you can see that these women in this Congolese dance are circling their hips. Yeah. And you can definitely see this movement here where they're pulsing on the floor, but like their aunties come into the video. And I love this video because it just goes to show how things that we've been seeing in the Western world as sexualized, that sexual layer, not that we aren't getting freaky, come on now, I'm not saying that, but the idea that these movements of the hips, or that even positioning yourself with body to body is a sexual thing, is a Western framing of those movements and those body parts, because Western civilization like really made sexuality taboo, right? And Christianity really made sexuality taboo. In this video, when I look at this, this looks like women massaging each other, or it even looks like birth preparation, but it's not sexual at all. And so I love seeing this video and seeing how obvious it is that these Congolese movements are definitely influencers of dance hall moves that we see now, right? Like twerking and like dance hall dancing absolutely has these kinds of hip movements, but they weren't initially dirty, quote unquote. Yeah. So those are the kind of ways that I'm hoping you guys will kind of like break out of your observational shell, so that we can really give more honor to the traditions behind the different dances. So there's more examples of African community dances here for you guys to deep dive into. This one I think is really interesting, these bottom two, because these are both, it's hard to not see these as sexual. And so like I left them in here so that you can kind of look at them and question for yourself, like, is the movement sexual, or is the way that we are perceiving them sexual? So this is like, this one fascinates me because it looks like it's maybe a wedding with professional dancers with the band, right? But this girl who's dancing and a couple of the female soloists in this video look like they are really enjoying doing their dances, and the way that they are treated by the men in this video is the thing that makes it look more sexual, I think. But you guys, I encourage, if you're feeling okay with like checking it out, like I love hearing people's responses to this. Also noticing the difference of the expressions by the audience members, like the women in the audience watching the dancers versus the men in the audience. I just think it's fascinating, the like layers that go on there. Okay, so I see we are getting close to the end of the hour. This page is going to deep dive. This guy right here, is that's not, I'm wondering who this speaker is. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm gonna take a moment here and skip over to this history video, which is, I'll stick it in the resources page. So I love touching on this part of the history because I think in America right now, just like in Germany, there are still people who are essentially denying slavery, or saying it wasn't that bad, or, I mean, thank goodness we don't live in the South, but I'm sure you are all aware that some people are really not accepting of how horrible it was and how much work there still is to do. And one of the myths that I have heard from my extended family that is from the South is this this myth that there were not uprisings. Like if the slaves were so unhappy, why didn't they escape? Which is like just absolute BS, right? So to take a moment to cover
form of resistance to slavery was
3
actual
minutes.
armed rebellion,
Let's
which was attempted.
watch
Now,
this.
individuals sometimes took matters into their own hands and feet, or even killed their white overseers or masters, like Bob, the guy who received the arbitrary beating, responded to it by killing his overseer with a hoe. But that said, large-scale slave uprisings were relatively rare. The 4 most famous ones all took place in a 35-year period at the beginning of the 19th century. Gabriel's rebellion in 1800, which we talked about before, was discovered before he was able to carry out his plot. Then in 1811, a group of slaves upriver from New Orleans seized cane, knives, and guns and marched on the city before militia stopped them. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a former slave who had purchased his freedom, may have organized a plot to destroy Charleston, South Carolina. I say may have because the evidence against him is disputed and comes from a trial that was not fair. But regardless, the end result of that trial is that he was executed, as were 34 slaves. But the most successful slave rebellion, at least in the sense that they actually killed some people, was Nat Turner's in August 1831. Turner was a preacher, and with a group of about 80 slaves, he marched from farm to farm in Southampton County, Virginia, killing the inhabitants, most of whom were women and children because the men were attending a religious revival meeting in North Carolina. Turner and 17 other rebels were captured and executed, but not before they struck terror into the hearts of whites all across the American South. Virginia's response was to make slavery worse, passing even harsher laws that forbade slaves from preaching and prohibited teaching them to read. Other slave states followed Virginia's lead, and by the 1830s, slavery had grown, if anything, more harsh. So this shows that large-scale armed resistance was, Django Unchained aside, not just suicidal, but also a threat to loved ones and really to all slaves. But it is hugely important to emphasize that slaves did resist their oppression. Sometimes this meant taking up arms, but usually it meant more subtle forms of resistance, like intentional work slowdowns, or sabotaging equipment, or pretending not to understand instructions. And most importantly, in the face of systematic legal and cultural degradation, they reaffirmed their humanity through family and through faith. Why is this so important? Because too often in America, we still talk about slaves as if they failed to rise up, when in fact, rising up would not have made life better for them or for their families. The truth is, sometimes carving out an identity as a human being in a social order that is constantly seeking to dehumanize you is the most powerful form of resistance. Refusing to become the chattel that their masters believed them to be is what made slavery untenable and the Civil War inevitable. So make no mistake, slaves fought back, and in the end, they won. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed.
So first of all, I looked really hard for a speaker who would cover some of those historical points who wasn't a white guy. And I went with this one mostly because I really appreciated his editing and visual aids because it's quick. So, but you know, if you see something better, please let me know. So the reason why I like to show that clip is because I think it's really important to highlight the fact that we had, after Nat Turner's rebellion, we had additional laws that came into effect that not only were the slaves and chattel and treated like animals and abused, but that on top of that, when we had the rebellions, there were not just slaves rebelling, but also at that time the indentured servants who were, for example, the Irish and the other immigrants who'd come in, who would be not slaves, but they would have a period of time for like 6 or 8 years where they would be working. Those workers had certain hours per day. They were free after hours. They could marry as they wanted. And so at the time, those two groups often fought together in those rebellions. And after those rebellions happened, the white landowners added additional laws to make those two groups even less similar, so that they could really crush the African slaves. And because they knew that if the African slaves and the white immigrant workers joined together, they could not keep them down. And that is really the beginning of racist casteism in our country. And one of the reasons why that relates so thoroughly to dance is because that was the time when they made it illegal for slaves to dance in public together, or to have drums, or to do, right? They took those things away because they saw those as a possibility, as a call to action, because that drumming and dancing were two of the ways that the African slaves who were brought over during the Middle Passage learned to communicate and create community with each other, when often slaves were not all brought over from the same place in Africa. And there were so many different communities, dialects, and languages that came over that a lot of the time the slaves who brought over would be living together, like forced together by having been bought together, but they wouldn't share a language other than that they could both share the percussive rhythms and dance moves as a way to get along. And so the creation of identity for these people who had been stolen from their land and often were separated from anybody who spoke the same language of the country that they came from, that even before the uprisings was a way that African slaves made community with other African slaves who didn't come from the same place. And then the taking away of the music and dance after the rebellions in the early 1800s was designed to make the African slaves even less human and less able to rise up. So if you should run into someone who is denying that it was that bad, I encourage, well, I mean, I'm not encouraging y'all to try and educate anybody, but this is where I'm coming from in terms of how we, America, can better understand how racism has been working and how we participate in racism in our country. This great book, Cast, which talks about the way that we have lived in a system which self-reinforces racist ideas in our heads. So in that quick clip, one of the things that he mentioned was that because actual uprisings would lead to violence that was taken out not just on the person who might have talked back to their master, but also like their whole family could be killed or beaten or raped, that often there was like more sort of passive aggressive or subtle ways of resistance, including acting like you don't understand what's going on in order to like slow down the work that you're being forced to do. So that act would, of course, reinforce the slave owners' ideas that their slaves weren't comprehending what was going on, when in fact they might have been rebelling in their face. This idea of using subtle ways to rebel with your body, like, leads to, we're going to talk about the cakewalk coming up, which is where slaves would get together and put on their fancy clothes and totally mock their slave owners by standing up super tall and acting ridiculous. And yet that way of coming together and doing the cakewalk, which is often even a competition in which you would win a cake for being the most ridiculous mocker of your slave owners, became an international sensation and became a dance that was like signified American modernism, which is just so ironic, right? Okay, so let's bring it back down to this module. We've got great videos here for you to check out. This page is really talking about like colonialism and slavery, but there's also some really uplifting videos here. This is got some demonstration of Pat and Juba, which is a dance form that was a blend of those two things, right? It's making percussion when you don't have drums, which is, if anything, a true way to own your body. Like if you are a person who is enslaved and you're told repeatedly that you have no control over your body and that you don't own your own body, dancing is a way of taking that back. So this one's super fun. He demonstrates classic Pat and Juba. And there's just a little foray here in this section on Chicago's World's Fair, which is also a way that America created a lot of the stereotypes that ended up going into minstrel shows, which is, we'll get more into that next week, but just know that we're going to talk a bit about how colonial presence in other countries would both the colonial presence and the people living there started to present snippets of cultures in the world's fairs around the world, and those snippets had some benefits for the countries who were trying to get up on their own 2 feet, but also created this stereotypical little dance vignettes and trends of dancing in America that then ended up becoming stereotypes. And once they were stereotypes, they ended up sometimes celebrating the culture that they were coming from, like we were talking about with fusion versus hybridization, but often ended up becoming stereotypes that we now see as melded into other dominant groups' expectations and used to put other cultures into a box. This page is talking about the ring shout. Remember, I was mentioning a bit of formation changes. So we'll talk a little bit more next week about the shape of the ring shout and how that it comes from a religious based dance, but you can still see it in b-boy circles today. So we'll go over some of this stuff some more next week. And just looking at other influences on community dancing. And then Jim Crow is assigned for this week, but I assume that we're just getting to it. If you've never read it before, it's heavy, but I feel like it's really game-changing to get an idea of how the Jim Crow laws also made it like we talked today a little bit about how laws in the 1800s interacted with the culture of dancing of the people in the Americas. And then Jim Crow is going to talk about a more recent example of that happening. Like, why is it important that we dance? Why is dance a form of rebellion? And also, how do laws oppress people in this country in ways that we've now sort of integrated as a nation into our caste system? So, I will update this link to today because there's our old one. I'm going to stop sharing. How are we doing? Are you totally overwhelmed with the volume of stuff that we've covered?
No, I'm not overwhelmed.
Okay, good. Thank you, Damien. Do you have?
Yeah, sounds good.
Did that help a little bit? My hope for these meetings is to sort of put the weekly readings into context. So I hope that you guys can come to them having scanned through the weekly stuff, but not necessarily having gotten through all of it, but enough that you guys can ask me some questions about, like, why are we talking about this, or how do these things connect? And if anything is exciting or annoying or makes you angry or makes you feel passionate, I totally want to hear about the stuff that stands out to you guys. And the more that you guys bring to me with questions or excitement, the less I will talk and the more that you guys can talk, which is great. Yeah.
Yep.
Sounds good.
Any other questions for today? Or are you ready for the weekend?
I'm just ready for the weekend.
Awesome. Okay, well then let's end this discussion for today, and I'm going to be nearby if you have any more questions, and otherwise I will look forward to chatting with you guys more next week.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Have a good weekend.
Okay.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Feel free to reach out with me about anything. Oh, yes, we can do our sign out. Thanks.
We were supposed to do that, right? Sign out?
Yes. I mean, there's
Okay,
3 of you, so I probably keep track of it. Well,
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I thought, I thought I read that somewhere in the instructions.
yes.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good weekend.